Hello and welcome back to my channel. Anybody who's been watching any of these videos that I've done in the last 5 or 6 months, or listened to anything I've really said about books in the past, will know that I really believe that the books that we read form us, they create us, and the books that we love especially really do have a big part in who we turn out to be. And as I said before, I've been keeping journals and lists of everything I've read for a long time now. Since I was 20, I started keeping a proper list of everything. At 20, I had to remember everything I'd read before that and fill pages with titles of kids' books that I'd read. From spring 1990, I started noting everything down properly. And it means that now I can go back and draw up these amazing lists of the books that I think now turned out to be very important to me. And what I've been doing this morning is dusting off some shelves and pulling out books so I can at least put some in order. What I'd like is a bookcase that had a kind of chronological order to do with when I encountered certain books. It's my symbolic autobiography. The quote comes from, I think, Roland Barthes, I'm not sure. But the idea that your bibliography is your symbolic autobiography is interesting. But if I go back and pick out the absolutely central books from each year, it gets quite interesting. For me, anyway. On average, it seems to be about 12 books per year, although 1992 is outrageous and there's an awful lot of favourite books. There's something about being 22, I think, and open to everything that's going on, for good and bad. Means that there's a lot of favourite books got read that year, a lot of favourite authors that got discovered that year. But, you know, the years around it aren't too bad. And looking back at the 90s, it's a pretty productive time in terms of filling up my bookshelves. It does make me wonder if I got this down to 10 or 12 books per year, maybe that could be all the books I needed. Maybe that's it. I doubt it, but it would still be nice to have them together. Anyway, just to go through 1990, for example, I would have to begin with Armistead Maupin's Tales of the City, which was such a revelation in terms of not just queer fiction, gay fiction, but soap opera style dialogue and the way that ordinary people talk to each other in novels. And for somebody who'd been reading the classics, it was a big revelation. I love those covers as well. That whole series with these covers was the best, and they should just go back to them. Classics. It was also the year that I discovered Christopher Isherwood and the Berlin novels. Really, it was Goodbye to Berlin, which again, with its wonderful, snappy dialogue, film-like dialogue, really got me. And the conjuring up of that particular era and place. It was the year that I discovered Anne Tyler, and this is her first If Morning Ever Comes, which was summer 1990, when it was as warm and stifling as it is now. I lived in a house that was half covered in soot because we'd had a house fire in our student house, and I was living alone there for that summer, at least for some of it, until the house got filled up again around me with friends. And we'd have to go to the park at the top of Lancaster, the Memorial Park, and sit by the Ashton Memorial, which is this amazing folly, to get some cool, to sit in the sun away from this stifling, rather dark house. Another Anne Tyler from that summer, which I read again in 2020, and it's just as good, and I've watched the film a million times. The Accidental Tourist. Possibly her best, I don't know. Maybe her best. Now, in order. Gay fiction aplenty. I'd discovered Edmund White and A Boy's Own Story, which everybody in my generation of gay men discovered at the same time. Yeah, 1991 and again in 2019. Lots of these I've reread 20 or 30 years on. It's interesting. It's interesting that I've had to revisit over the years. And John Irving, Hotel New Hampshire. This is a nicer edition, Jonathan Cape edition, in hardback than the one I read. I read a Black Swan paperback that I just loved, which is over there and falling apart. Do I prefer this one? I don't know. Actually, this is a first edition. See, I don't really pay attention to what I've got. It's just if I like them. But it's probably quite a nice thing to have. Then I discovered Angela Carter in, I think we're moving on to 1991. Right, this is the year where I read quite a lot and it all went a bit crazy. Not as crazy as 92, but in 91 I discovered Angela Carter for the first time. The Bloody Chamber. This is the classic edition that everybody had at that point. Again, why mess about with it? It's the perfect cover with this bleeding lily and dead insects. A Night at the Circus, which I read just before that actually. I discovered Salinger in W.H. Smith's in Lancaster when I went through, in order, through their fiction section of modern classics, reading the books that weren't on our courses. His short stories. I'd read Catcher in the Rye when I was a teenager, but I hadn't read the others. And then at the end of that year, discovering Jeanette Winterson and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. I'm not sure these are exactly in order now. Never mind. Also in 91, I think, yeah, this is kind of autumn 91. This fantastic biography of Noel Coward. Not quite outing him properly, but it's there between the lines. If you read carefully, it's very funny as well. I'm going to knock all these over again. You've seen so many book avalanches in these videos. Jodie Scott and I, Vampire, a feminist, crazy, surreal science fiction novel from the Women's Press. We're getting into the era when I was buying remaindered books in different genres and digging around in the cheap stacks, which is always the place to look. What are the books that other people have overlooked? That's what you find in those places. More John Irving, and this is a lovely edition of The World According to Garp. The print is so tiny. I think I do prefer my Black Swan paperbacks. I might have to replace them with these, or rather replace the hardbacks with those on the shelf. Jeff Ryman, The Child Garden. I remember when this came out, when they were talking about it in the blurb. I've cleaned the covers, but there's dust on the top of some of these. And they described it as Max Ernst meets Derek Jarman. And that was enough for me. This is the one about the opera singing polar bear. And it's such a strange book. But it drew me straight into his world. Christopher Coe's I Look Divine, which was a gay novel of the time. Very stylish. Ian Hamilton's In Search of J.D. Salinger. These stories led me on to discover more about the legend of Salinger and his famous reclusiveness. And the Hamilton book, I think, is better than all the books that have followed since about Salinger, because he puts himself into it, and he has that weird moment where he personally manages to draw Salinger out into public for the first time in decades, and feels ashamed of himself for doing so, I think. I talked about this one before, Christopher Osborne, A Sense of Touch. Another very out gay novel about a concert pianist and cruising in Rome. A very strange fantasy novel, Egypt, by John Crowley, which I picked out again recently thinking I would return to, and I could remember very little of it. I do remember I sat down with a couple of massive fantasy novels like this after my finals in 1991. So this was summer 91. I've done these in the wrong order. More Jeanette Winterson. I went through and read everything up to date at this point. This is her book about Napoleon and Napoleon's chicken plucker and Venice and more fairy tales. And in the middle of 91, this, which I've talked about before, this huge anthology of gay fiction, edited by Edmund White. And it was a present from my Shakespeare tutor, who waited very patiently, sweetly and properly to ask me out on a date on the very day of my finals results. Very proper, and it was a nice gift. So that's 90 and 91, when I'm 20 and 21. And it's an amazing selection of things, really. Lots of gay fiction, lots of science fiction and biography, and these American novels which are teaching me to write the language of ordinary people and the way they talk, and not get too fancy, and rely on my own ear and how I pick up on how people talk and the importance of that. Anyway, that's 91, 92. I could whiz through. No, 90 and 91. 92 is here. Slightly less, slightly fewer, I think. No, there's just as many. I think 92 and 93 were even better years. David Levitt's Lost Language of the Cranes, which I first knew about as a TV movie, and then I read all of his novels to date at that point. I read this in April 92. I was doing my MA. It was another book that gives you a glimpse of gay America. Very different. Italo Calvino, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller, which I've explained to people in recent years, and they are kind of gobsmacked that anybody would read such a thing. But it begins in a bookshop, and every chapter is the opening chapter of a different novel. As someone picks up book after book after book, it's stories within stories. But of course, you realise that things are linked as you go through. More Angela Carter, as I started exploring her whole backlist in the year that she died, 92, and I applied for a PhD about her and went on to do that after my MA. The Magic Toy Shop is definitely my top 3 of her books, alongside the 2 I mentioned earlier. It's where she writes a fairy tale head on and conjures a very succinct and colourful world and shows us all the darkness in the fairy tale. Speaking of which, this was a volume for dipping into of the time. Borges and his book of fantasy. Every single story, every bit of this was so weird and strange. And it was all in that beautiful black swan font as well. I really am not a font weirdo. I do sound like it sometimes. The Party-Coloured Unicorn by John de Clay, which kind of out-Pratchett's Terry Pratchett, I always thought. I loved this book. It's a proper comic fantasy. And again, the product of digging around in those remainder bookshops. Right, last little pile for 92. The first Jeanette Winterson I read, Sexing the Cherry, or maybe the second. This is Jeremy's copy, and I've kind of nicked it, because mine is an old paperback, which has got a really beautiful cover. This isn't quite so nice, but it's a nice edition inside, and I may be ready for a reread. That's the point of putting these things together, I think, that you just see the covers and you see the names on lists. When you put them together and handle the books again and clean the covers and think about shelving them together, it does make you want to delve in again, and that's a good idea. Moran Tyler, Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant. I talked about this yesterday, I think, and it's one of the best, I think. I think her best period is kind of 83 with this, and then 85, The Accidental Tourist, and then you get up to Breathing Lessons and St. Maybe, and Ladder of Years. So it's kind of 83 to 95, I would say, are her best years. Although, you know, she's been writing all this time and I've read everything. Those are my favourite bits. Sarah Maitland's A Book of Spells, which is a wonderful magical realist collection of short stories that I read at the beginning of 92. No, the end of 92. Christmas 92. And very inspirational. I got to know her. We became friends in the 90s. Lots of these people I've met over the years or been in touch with. This is a remainder novel that I found in Lancaster, Fall of the Flamingo Circus by Kate Rigby, and it's one of my all-time favourites. It's a punk portrait of the artist as a young man, or a young woman in this case. Laura Shanz's 7-year-old diary, and then she gets older and older in this world full of punks and people living in squats. It's a really lovely book. More Jeff Ryman was his book about The Wizard of Oz and Judy Garland from the summer of 92. I've read this many times. Maybe it's time to go back to it. A big vogue in the 90s was to do with novels where chapters moved suddenly from place to place and time to time, different levels of reality, and we had to, as the reader, stitch them together in our minds. They broke up the easygoing chronology of ordinary fiction. That's what they did in the 90s. Although at the same time, some novels kept those unities and moved us very grandly over the years, through the years, in generational sagas like this, which is one of the best, St. Maybe by Anne Tyler, which I read first in the spring of 92, and I've read it maybe every couple of years since. I think I haven't for a few years now, and it's ready for a reread. This is my book club edition. When you used to join those book clubs and you'd get a big discount on your first order, but then they would plague you with parcels on your doorstep forever after, and you could never escape. And you ended up buying these softback preview things, books the size of hardbacks, but soft, with a kind of canvassy cover. They plagued everybody, every book lover's life in the 80s and 90s. But I'm pleased to have this edition. It's very nostalgic. Yeah. And another Anne Tyler, Morgan's Passing, one of her 70s novels, which again I've read several times, and this copy is falling to pieces. Somewhere I hope I have a hardback. I did go through a stage of trying to find them all in more hard-wearing editions. Right, I shall stop there. You've had 1991 and 92. Lots of recommendations to discover these books that meant an awful lot to me. Looking back, it's quite a small number of authors, given that I was reading about whatever it was, 120 books a year. I consolidated quite quickly on my queers and magical realists and saga writers. Those are the big categories. And my biographies. Okay, I shall go. I'll see you again soon in the next episode. Goodbye.